The Sherman tank wasn't the best tank of World War II. It wasn't the most feared. It wasn't the one that made headlines or inspired legends. But if you read the letters and diaries of German soldiers who fought against it, you'll find something unexpected. Respect. Not the kind of respect you give to a superior weapon, but the kind you give to an opponent who just won't quit. The kind you give to something that represents a force you can't stop. This is the story of why German soldiers came to respect the Sherman tank. When the Sherman first appeared on the battlefield, German tankers weren't impressed. They had faced British tanks in North Africa. They had seen Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front. The Sherman looked like just another Allied tank, maybe even worse than some. German intelligence reports noted its specifications. Thin armor, a 75 gun that couldn't penetrate heavy German armor at distance. A high profile that made it an easy target. On paper, the Sherman was nothing special. German crews had fought in Panzer IVs, Tigers, and Panthers. They knew what a real tank looked like, and the Sherman didn't seem to measure up. The first encounters happened in North Africa. American forces landed in Operation Torch with their Shermans. German crews expected easy victories, and at first they got them. A Tiger could knock out a Sherman from 1,000 meters. The Sherman's 75 gun bounced off Tiger armor at most ranges. In head-to-head engagements, the German tanks won. German tankers wrote home about these victories. They told their families that American tanks were no match for German engineering. But something else was happening, something they didn't write about at first. The Shermans kept coming back. After North Africa came Italy, then came Normandy. And by Normandy, something had changed in the way German soldiers talked about the Sherman. The mockery was gone, the easy confidence had faded, because they had learned something. The Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a symptom of something much bigger, something that couldn't be stopped by superior engineering or better armor. It was a symptom of American industrial power. Let's talk about reliability. This is where German respect for the Sherman really started. German tanks were engineering marvels. The Tiger had an 88 gun that could destroy anything on the battlefield. The Panther had sloped armor and excellent optics, but they broke down constantly. The Tiger needed hours of maintenance for every hour of operation. Transmissions failed, engines overheated, parts wore out, and replacement parts were hard to get. German tankers spent more time repairing their vehicles than fighting in them. They knew this. They lived it every day. Then they watched the Shermans. These American tanks just kept running. They moved from battle to battle without breaking down. Their engines were simple, reliable, mass-produced. Their parts were interchangeable. When something did break, American crews had it fixed in hours, not days. German soldiers noticed this. In their letters and diaries, they wrote about it. They wrote about watching Sherman columns move past their own broken-down vehicles. They wrote about how American tanks were always ready, while German tanks sat waiting for parts that never came. One German tanker wrote in his diary about watching a Sherman take a hit that damaged its track. He expected the crew to abandon it. Instead, American mechanics showed up within an hour. They had the track repaired in 3 hours. The Sherman was back in action the same day. Meanwhile, his own Panther had been waiting 2 weeks for a replacement transmission. This wasn't about better engineering. This was about a system that worked. And German soldiers respected that system even as they fought against it. Speed mattered too. The Sherman was fast, not just in straight-line speed, but in maneuverability. It could turn quickly, it could reverse rapidly. German tankers and Tigers and Panthers had powerful guns and thick armor, but their tanks were slow and ponderous. A Tiger weighed 56 tons. It was built for frontal assaults in defensive positions. The Sherman weighed 33 tons. It was built to move. German crews learned that Shermans wouldn't sit still and trade shots. They would flank. They would maneuver. They would use speed to get around heavy German armor and hit from the sides or rear. This created a tactical problem that German tankers wrote about extensively. Yes, a Tiger could destroy a Sherman in a frontal engagement, but the Shermans wouldn't give you a frontal engagement if they could help it. They would spread out. They would move fast. By the time you rotated your turret to engage one Sherman, 2 more had moved to your flanks. German training emphasized the superiority of their weapons, but that superiority meant nothing if you couldn't bring your gun to bear. Then there was the numbers. This is what really changed German perception of the Sherman. It wasn't about individual tank quality, it was about quantity. American factories produced nearly 50,000 Shermans during the war. 50,000. German factories produced about 6,000 Panthers and fewer than 2,000 Tigers. German soldiers did the math. They knew what it meant. One German tanker wrote that destroying a Sherman felt pointless because 5 more would replace it tomorrow. Another wrote that American tank production was like a flood that couldn't be stopped. This wasn't just about tanks either. It was about everything. German soldiers saw American logistics up close. They saw the trucks, the fuel, the ammunition, the spare parts, the food, the medical supplies. Everything arrived in endless quantities. Meanwhile, German supply lines were collapsing. Fuel was scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Food was short. They were fighting a wealthy enemy who could afford to lose equipment and replace it immediately. The Sherman became the symbol of this disparity. German respect for the Sherman grew from understanding what it represented. It represented an industrial base that Germany couldn't match. It represented a supply system that worked. It represented an enemy that could absorb losses and keep fighting. One German officer wrote that every Sherman he saw reminded him that Germany was losing the war of production. Not the war of engineering or tactics or courage, but the war of factories and resources. And that was a war Germany couldn't win. Let's talk about how Shermans fought, because this mattered enormously to German soldiers. Shermans had radios. Every single Sherman had a radio. German tanks didn't. Only command tanks had radios. This meant Sherman crews could coordinate in real time. They could share information. They could call for support. They could adapt to changing situations instantly. German tankers noticed this. They noticed how Sherman platoons moved together, communicated constantly, and coordinated their attacks. It made the Shermans much more effective than their individual specifications suggested. Sherman crews also had combined arms support that German soldiers came to fear. The Shermans didn't attack alone. They came with infantry. They came with artillery support. They came with air cover. German tankers wrote about this combination. You might be engaging Shermans when suddenly American infantry would appear and threaten your position, or American artillery would start landing around you, or worst of all, American fighter bombers would show up. The Sherman was part of a system. German soldiers learned to respect that system because it was devastatingly effective. The psychological impact of the Sherman can't be overstated. Early in the war, German soldiers felt confident. They had better equipment. They had better training. They had proven themselves in Poland, France, and the early years in Russia. But by 1944, that confidence was gone. The Sherman was part of WWII, not because it was a better tank, but because it represented inevitable defeat. Every time German soldiers saw Shermans, they knew more were coming. They knew American industry was producing them faster than Germany could destroy them. They knew the war was lost. German diaries from the later war years show this psychological shift. The tone changes. Early entries mock Allied equipment. Later entries express resignation and fear. One soldier wrote that he used to laugh at Shermans. Now he feared them, not because they were dangerous individually, but because they were everywhere. Another wrote that seeing a Sherman column made him feel hopeless because he knew his side couldn't match that kind of production. The Sherman had become a symbol of American power and German defeat. There's a famous saying among German tankers, "One Tiger equals 5 Shermans, but there are always 6 Shermans." This wasn't just dark humor, it was recognition of reality. Yes, German tanks were often superior in direct combat, but combat wasn't just about one-on-one duels. It was about tactics, numbers, and logistics. Sherman crews knew their tanks were outgunned, so they adapted. They used their numbers. They flanked, they coordinated, they called in support, and they won. German tankers respected this approach even as it frustrated them. They were trained to believe in the superiority of German engineering and tactics, but the Americans had a different approach. They didn't try to build the best tank. They built a good enough tank and produced it in overwhelming numbers. They made it reliable so it stayed in the fight. They gave it radios so crews could coordinate. They supported it with infantry, artillery, and air power, and they kept the supply lines running so it always had fuel and ammunition. This approach worked. German soldiers saw that it worked, and they respected it. The Sherman also earned respect through its crews. German soldiers expected American tankers to be inexperienced and poorly trained. Sometimes they were right, but often they were wrong. American tank crews learned quickly. They adapted to German tactics. They became skilled at using their advantages in speed and numbers. They became brave in the face of superior German firepower. German After Action reports note instances of American tank crews showing remarkable courage and tactical skill. This wasn't what German propaganda had told them to expect. One German tanker wrote about an engagement where his Panther faced 4 Shermans. He destroyed 2 of them quickly. The other 2 should have retreated. Instead, they split up and attacked from different angles. One drew his fire while the other flanked and destroyed his tank. He survived and was captured. He wrote later that he had underestimated the American crew's tactical ability and courage. They knew they were outgunned but fought smart and won. Incidents like this changed German perceptions. By the end of the war, German soldiers had developed a complex view of the Sherman. They still believed German tanks were technically superior, but they recognized that technical superiority wasn't enough. The Sherman represented everything Germany lacked by 1944 and 1945. It represented reliable equipment. It represented endless supplies. It represented industrial capacity. It represented a wealthy nation that could afford to fight a long war. It represented an enemy that wouldn't quit. The Sherman tank was never going to win awards for best tank design. It had real weaknesses. Its armor was too thin. Its gun was underpowered against heavy German tanks. Its height made it a visible target. American tankers knew these problems. They called it a Ronson because it lit up when hit. They knew they were outgunned, but they also knew they had advantages. They had reliability. They had numbers. They had support. they had logistics. And they had a nation behind them that could replace every loss and keep fighting. German soldiers came to respect the Sherman not because it was a great tank, but because it was an effective weapon in the hands of a powerful nation. It did its job. It kept running. It kept coming. It couldn't be stopped by destroying a few tanks or winning a few battles. The only way to stop the Sherman was to stop American industrial production, and that was impossible. German soldiers understood this. They might destroy 10 Shermans in a battle and feel victorious. Then 20 more would show up the next day. The Sherman was relentless, and relentlessness, they learned, was its own kind of superiority. The legacy of the Sherman in German military memory is complicated. After the war, many German veterans continued to claim their tanks were better, and in many ways they were right, but they also acknowledged what the Sherman represented. It represented a different philosophy of war. Not the German emphasis on quality and engineering excellence, but the American emphasis on quantity, reliability, and logistics. Both approaches had merit, but in World War II, the American approach won. The Sherman tank was the vehicle of that victory, and German soldiers who fought against it learned to respect what it represented, even if they never stopped believing their own tanks were technically superior. In the end, the Sherman didn't need to be the best tank. It just needed to be good enough, reliable enough, and numerous enough, and it was.